Welcome to Lowell, Massachusetts, the heart of America's textile industry. Powerful mill owners controlled every step of the production process. Their fortunes depended on a steady supply of cotton, harvested from American southern states. The journey began here in the cotton fields of the South. The raw cotton was pressed into large bales and loaded onto cargo ships. These ships headed up the East Coast headed for New England. The shipment was then placed on horse and wagon, or by locomotives, or even placed on barges up the Merrimack River. Here's Amber.
The Lowell Mill Girls. Voices from the mills. Imagine waking up before dawn, the cold morning air pressing against your skin as the mill bells ring through the streets of Lowell, Massachusetts. Young women shuffle out of the crowded boarding houses, their skirts brushing against the frozen ground as they make their way toward the textile mills. Some of them are as young as 10. Others are in their late teens or early 20s. Just kidding. But most have one thing in common. This isn't the life they imagined. Between 1823 and 1841, Lowell experienced a textile mill boom, promising farm girls an opportunity to earn wages of their own, escape rural life, and claim a sliver of independence in a world where a woman's choices were all but few. But what they found inside the mills was not the dream they had been promised. It was long hours, dangerous machinery, air so thick with cotton dust and it choked their lungs, and the constant knowledge that at any moment an accident could change their lives forever. Yet, even in these grueling conditions, some of these girls left behind their voices in letters, in books, in protests. These were the Lowell Mill Girls, and this is their story. Lucy Larcom, the child who thought the mill was like playing. In 1835, 11-year-old Lucy Larcom walked through the doors of the Lowell Mills for the first time. She was small, full of energy, and eager to contribute to her struggling family. She was hired as a doffer, one of the youngest positions in the factory, responsible for quickly changing full bobbins of thread with empty ones. At first, she loved it. She would later write, "I went to my first day's work in the mill with a light heart. When I came back at night, the family began to pity me, but I laughed and said, 'Why? It is nothing but fun. It is just like play.'" But the excitement didn't last. As time passed, she began to feel the weight of exhaustion, the endless ringing of machinery, and the heavy air filled with floating bits of thread. Lucy missed school. She missed fresh air. She longed for a world beyond the factory walls. Still, she found ways to cope. She would write poetry in the rare quiet moments between shifts. She found joy in friendships with the other doffers, laughing and playing whenever they had a moment's rest. But even as a child, she understood that her work was shaping her future. "It was a pity that we were set to hard work while we were so young," she later wrote. Yet perhaps habits of conscientious work induce thought. Certainly, right thinking naturally impels people to work. Lucy Larcom eventually left the mills behind and became a teacher and writer, but she never forgot what it felt to be like a child inside a spinning room, staring out the windows, longing for something more. Harriet Hanson Robinson, the girl who led a strike at age 11. Before Harriet Hanson Robinson ever set foot in the mills, her world had already fallen apart. Her father had died unexpectedly, leaving behind a grieving widow and 2 daughters with no way to support themselves. Her mother, Mrs. Hanson, was forced to take a job as a boarding house keeper for the mills, one of the few respectable positions available to a woman on her own. But even then, that wasn't enough. Harriet, just 11 years old, had no choice but to go to work herself. She had no idea that within a year she would become one of the first female strike leaders in American history. Harriet wasn't just a quiet worker. She listened. She heard the other girls talking, whispering, about how the company was planning to cut their wages while raising the cost of their rent. The workers were furious. They weren't going to stand for it, so they planned something that had never been done before. A strike. The day came. The older girls came upstairs and they stopped working. They walked out of the factory, one by one, but on Harriet's floor, her co-workers hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to leave. Harriet felt something stir inside of her, a fire, a refusal to be afraid. And so she stood up, walked away from her machine, and shouted for all to hear, "I don't care what you do. I am going to turn out, whether anyone else does or not." One by one, the other girls followed her. Harriet later recalled, "I was more proud than I have ever been since at any success, and more proud than I shall ever be again until my own beloved state gives to its women citizens the right of suffrage." The strike did not succeed. The mill owners won. But Harriet never regretted her decision to walk out that day. She had tasted what it meant to fight for something bigger than herself, and she would never forget it. They did, however, reprimand Harriet for her choices by firing her mother. Their point was, maybe they couldn't have stopped all the other adult women from going on strike, but an 11-year-old girl she should have been able to still have control over, and since she didn't, they kicked her out onto the streets. Years later, Harriet would become a writer, a historian, a suffragist, helping to pave the way for women's right to vote. But it all began with that one moment, an 11-year-old girl standing alone in the face of injustice, daring others to follow. Sarah Bagley, the woman who demanded a 10-hour workday. When Sarah Bagley arrived at the Lowell Mills, she wasn't like most of the other girls. She was older, wiser. She had already spent years working, watching, and understanding how the system took advantage of its workers. At first, Sarah did what was expected. She worked hard. She even wrote cheerful essays about factory life for the Lowell Offering, the Mill Girls magazine. But as time passed, she saw what long hours and low wages were doing to the girls around her. By the early 1840s, things had gotten worse. The hours were longer. The conditions were harsher. So Sarah did something no one had ever done before. She formed the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association, the LFLRA. And she did not stop there. She and the other mill girls gathered over 2,000 signatures and sent them to the Massachusetts legislature demanding a 10-hour workday. Sarah stood before an all-male panel of lawmakers and testified. She spoke clearly, confidently. She described the exhaustion, the illnesses, the girls coughing from the dust in the air. She told them, "We only ask for time, time to obtain knowledge, time to become good wives and mothers, time to become fitted to mold the destinies of our country." Her words made history. The 10-hour workday was not granted immediately, but Sarah's fight set the stage for future labor reforms, and because of her, women had proved their voices mattered. Mary Paul, the girl who wrote it all down. Unlike the others, Mary Paul didn't lead a protest. She didn't write books. She didn't stand before a legislator. But she did something just as powerful. She wrote letters. She described what life was like, really, inside the mills. The exhaustion, the tiny paychecks, the deaths of girls who slipped on ice or were crushed by machinery. She wrote it all down, preserving a record of the truth. And in those records, she asked one haunting question. is it worth it? These were the Lowell Mill Girls. They fought for themselves, for each other, for the generations of women who would come after them. And because of them, history remembers. We remember. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It's the perfect recipe for engagement. And I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.